They say the campfire protects you, but fire doesn't keep the dark away. It only makes it easier for the dark to see you. Tonight, dread scribe writes, again. The first night in the forest should have been calm. I had hiked for hours beneath a canopy that swallowed the last scraps of daylight. And when I finally set my pack down, I thought the fire would be my anchor. Its warmth spread like a heartbeat through the clearing, the flames licking upward in restless tongues. Sparks floated skyward and vanished into the black as if the night were swallowing stars. I told myself the forest was indifferent, that the fire carved out a sanctuary where nothing could reach me. But safety, I would soon learn, is an illusion carved from fragile light. The firelight played across the trunks of the pines, painting them in gold and orange. My own shadow stretched long and skeletal across the dirt, its arms bending with the flames. At first it felt almost comforting, a reminder of form and presence in the wilderness. But then, as the minutes bled into hours, something shifted. The shadows began to move out of sync with the fire. When the flames hissed low, the silhouettes should have shrunk. Instead, one seemed to twitch as if taking a step forward. My chest tightened. Was it exhaustion, or had the night learned how to borrow my shape? I leaned closer, squinting into the trembling dark. The crackle of pine snapped through the silence, sharp and sudden, like bones breaking. A sour metallic tang rode the smoke, not just wood but something harsher, biting at the back of my throat. I remembered reading that burning certain plants releases strange toxins, sometimes hallucinogenic. That thought was a lifeline. Maybe my mind was crafting phantoms from chemistry. But then came the question that gnawed at me. If this was just in my head, why did the ground seem to shiver under the shadow's steps? I pressed my palms to the earth, damp and cool beneath the litter of needles. The soil carried vibrations, faint, rhythmic, as though something mirrored my heartbeat. From below, I told myself it was nothing more than the fire's crackle reverberating, but the human brain doesn't lie when fear takes root. Each beat of the ground felt deliberate, like a pulse answering mine. The forest was not just watching, it was breathing. My eyes traced the edge of the clearing where the light collapsed into black. There, shapes lingered. Not branches, not smoke, but impressions, darker than dark. They hovered, as if waiting for permission to step closer. I tried to focus on rationality, on the science of perception. In low light, our brains exaggerate contrast. Shadows can seem alive. Yet knowledge did nothing to settle the instinct screaming through my veins. Instinct is older than reason, older than fire. A gust of wind scattered the fire into a sudden roar, and for an instant, every shadow lunged forward at once. My breath froze. It looked like an audience rushing the stage, only to retreat when the flames calmed. My body was trembling, but my thoughts moved with strange clarity. Perhaps firelight doesn't chase the dark away. Perhaps it draws it nearer. I stayed awake until the embers dimmed into a bed of glowing coals. The forest returned to silence, but silence now felt like a predator crouching just beyond reach. My eyes burned from sleeplessness, yet I dared not close them. Because just before dawn, I saw the dirt beside my pack shift as if clawed by something invisible. Proof that the night had not only watched me, but reached for me. And when morning finally broke, I would discover that the ground carried more than just my footprints. Morning split the trees into ribs of pale light. The clearing felt like a chest unclenching. Dew limned the ash and silver, yet the metallic scent lingered. Around my bedroll, the dirt was scored in crescents and hooks, less prints than intentions. I traced them with a twig, counting gaps. Whatever had written the ground had circled me, pausing by the fire as if reading a dial. I tried to classify what I saw, because names feel like fences. Bears splay wide, cats leave neat commas, raccoons sign with small hands. The marks were deep at the tips, shallow at the heel, as if something tested the ground without committing weight. The stride lengthened near the fire and shortened in shadow. I remembered the pamphlet, and Maya, my biologist friend, her laugh like field glass. Follow data, not fear. The crescents led toward a creek that braided through the pines. Between two stones lay 5 pebbles like ribs, each aligned to a claw mark, a cairn that felt less like a guide than a diagram. Water slid over it in a whisper, like someone rehearsing a word they feared. Maybe a camper made it, maybe current pretended at intelligence, but I wasn't prepared for the echo ahead. On a sun-warmed boulder, soot had sketched a silhouette my size, feathered as though smoke. Tried to remember me. I brushed the edge. Blackness came away fine as moth dust. I told myself about thermal plumes. Heat rises, distorts air, paints erratic strokes from ash. A professor once called fire a moving lens. Still, the outline matched my shoulders with eerie accuracy, like a mirror taught to guess. Fear pressed in, then loosened like a tide. Curiosity moved through my chest, the way wind moves through needles, thrumming. When panic climbed, I heard my sister teaching box breathing after a bad night. Inhale, hold, exhale, hold, scaffolding in a storm. I returned to the clearing and rebuilt the ring, neat as a lab bench. If the night wanted a lantern, I would give it one and watch what it wrote. The flame rose like a thin reed, then thickened into a brush, painting trunks with honeyed bands. I filmed and counted beats. When the fire gulped air, shadow limbs gathered. When it steadied, they smoothed, outward like seagrass in tide. Wind could do that, I told myself. Ears invent direction, eyes carve pattern from noise. But then it broke. Ash drifted upstream, and the coals dimmed where a darker smear pressed. I checked my compass and watched the needle quiver, as if the hill carried iron veins beneath the roots. Sleep loss breeds pareidolia, I reminded myself. Microseisms can tremble soil like a hidden drum. But the result wouldn't leave. Every explanation kept pointing me relentlessly back to the flame. I didn't run. I packed slowly, keeping one eye on the ring. The crescents had multiplied into a near circle, precise as a surveyor's line. Reaching for my canteen, I found a soot ridge on my wrist, spaced to my own fingers, as if I'd been held by my shadow. The fire popped. A coal died the instant it touched the newest mark. Light, I realized, was less shield than signal. If the forest had been reading me, what sentence had I just spelled? And who exactly was learning the language? The forest had been unnervingly still that evening, the kind of silence that settles on your shoulders like a heavy shawl. My friend's tent stood just a few feet from mine, its fabric glowing faintly orange from the lantern he had left inside. We had laughed earlier about how flimsy nylon walls could feel like fortresses, fragile shelters standing against a world older and wilder than we could comprehend. I remember glancing at his tent before unzipping mine, the sight of it a small comfort. But when I looked again, mere minutes later, it was gone. Not collapsed, not torn, not dragged aside, simply gone. Where canvas and poles had stood, there was only pressed earth and a ring of pine needles swept bare, as though the ground had forgotten the weight that once pressed it. My first thought was absurd. Maybe I had misremembered where he set up camp. But no, my eyes knew the spot, and the ground knew it too. It looked like an erasure, a chalk line wiped from a blackboard. I called his name, expecting a muffled reply, maybe irritation for breaking the calm. Nothing answered but my own echo, thin and brittle among the trees. My voice cracked against the trunks, scattering upward, returning hollow. I shouted again until the silence thickened into something physical, like fog filling my lungs. It was then that I noticed the ground. The soil was scored with marks I could not classify, deep, narrow impressions running in arcs around the spot. They were not paw prints, not boot treads. They were crescents ending in hooks, pressed deep at the tips as if something sharp had tested its grip in the earth. I knelt down, brushing my fingertips over them. The dirt was cool, damp, carrying the faint metallic scent of disturbed iron. I thought of claws, though I had never seen claws this wide. The marks led outward, curving toward the trees. I followed them with my headlamp, its beam carving through. Mist like a scalpel, and there, hanging absurdly high in the branches, were fragments of my friend's gear. His canteen wedged between two limbs, his jacket snagged 20 feet above, swaying gently as though placed by deliberate hands. I knew wind could scatter objects, but not launch them skyward into neat display. It looked like evidence arranged for me to find. My chest pounded, torn between climbing up to retrieve them and staying grounded in the only safety I trusted, the circle of firelight behind me. I remembered once reading about owls carrying off small tents in Arctic camps, but no bird alive could lift a man and his belongings so cleanly, couldn't it? The mind starts negotiating with itself in moments like these, bargaining with reason to build bridges across impossible gaps. But bridges creak when the foundations crack. The strangest part wasn't the missing tent or the claw marks, but the absence of sound. No tearing fabric, no struggle, not even a snapped branch. It was as if the forest had inhaled and chosen not to exhale again. And as I stood beneath the hanging jacket, craning my neck, I realized the zipper was undone, open as though someone had carefully emptied it before placing it out of reach. They were rewriting the scene altogether. Morning seeped into the clearing like diluted ink, and with it came the certainty this wasn't a prank or a panic dream. I slowed my breathing and cataloged details like a field tech. Pine needles combed outward in a halo, ash specks fell one way, and the crescents ended at the roots as if the trees had shut a door. I kept repeating a rule: record first, interpret later. Interpretation barged in anyway, carrying my friend's laugh and our last dumb joke. Guilt moved through me like cold water. I had trusted thin walls to matter, proximity to mean protection. If the woods could erase a tent, what did it take to erase the person who zipped it? The question pressed the back of my neck. I searched the branches again, and the scene resolved like a museum display. The jacket hung draped, sleeves aligned, collar centered to the trunk's seam. His enamel mug glittered in a crotch of limbs, turned outward like an exhibit label. Whoever had lifted his things had a taste for arrangement. But why curate fear? Rational trails beckoned. Maybe katabatic wind funneled through the ravine, a bellows in a pine organ. Maybe an owl dragged small items upward, and I stitched a legend to fill the gaps. I remembered a lecture about infrasound, low frequencies that tremble organs and warp perception. But what if the missing sound wasn't absence at all? What if something had taught the forest to swallow it? I climbed to the first branch and found sap streaks fresh as tears. Resin glued grit to my palms. Air tasted like pepper and honey. 20 feet up, a loop of guy line had been threaded through a knot and tied with a clumsy half-hitch I recognized as his. Relief flared, then chilled. He had touched this point after the vanishing. Did he climb out, or was he put here? Back on the ground, I mapped the crescents with stakes and cord. The arcs formed a spiral centered on the missing tent site, a shape like a galaxy sketched into soil. My compass jittered as if the clearing wore a weak magnet's coat. Ironstone could do that, I told myself. So could fear. But the pattern refused to relax into coincidence. I set a test. I staked a line from the spiral's edge to a low branch and pulled it taut, then stepped away until the thread hummed softly, a violin string between bark and earth. If something moved here, the line would sing. I waited. The forest held its breath. Then, without wind, the cord began to vibrate in traveling waves that ran inward toward the center and stopped. But what I saw next collapsed the experiment into confession. My headlamp brushed the dirt and revealed the faintest outline of a rectangle where the tent once rested, not imprinted but lighter, as if the earth had been unweighted and then polished with silence. The shape shimmered like heat over asphalt. When I reached for it, cold bled into my fingertips. A zipper rasped above me, slow, careful, intimate, as though a lanterned room were opening in the canopy. The jacket sleeves lifted in a wind that did not touch my face. And the forest, polite as a host, seemed to make space for something I could not see. The trail began as a soft ribbon through firs and ferns, and by late afternoon it had narrowed into a single line of damp moss. My breath steadied into a metronome. Gravel clicked under my boots with the punctuation of commas. The forest listened without comment, a cathedral of green vaults and dim-stained light, and vast. Then the second instrument arrived. My sound doubled, footfalls behind me landing exactly when mine did. At first I blamed acoustics. Valleys throw sound like children skipping stones. Peaks bounce rhythm back in neat stanzas. I pictured my steps ricocheting off trunks and returning loyal. But the rhythm felt too personal, like a stranger matching my breath, like sharing a pulse with a mirror that preferred to lead. I lengthened my stride. The echo lengthened. I shortened it. The echo obeyed. I thought of Dr. Lin, who once let us stand inside an anechoic chamber until we could hear our own blood, a hush so total it lifted nausea like a curtain. She said the brain hates silence and fills it with ghosts. That memory steadied me like a lighthouse, but it also pried open a worry. The chamber was built by people. This chamber had teeth. To test it, I stopped dead on the trail. Pine scent pooled in the pause. The late light became brass, and a fly stitched lazy figure eights near my ear. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then the footsteps came. 2 presses. In the soil behind me, crisp, perfectly spaced, without me, like signatures forged now. My scalp tightened. The copy had outgrown the original. I tried logic the way you try a lock you already know is jammed. Maybe a deer tracked parallel in duff, hooves aligning by chance. Maybe a person padded shy. But chance seldom braids itself. This cleanly and shyness does not breathe on the back of your neck like a cold hand. I walked again, this time counting 1, 2, 3 in my head. The answer counted with me, a metronome in a mouth I couldn't see. I left the trail for a patch of wind-fallen needles soft as velvet. Needles swallow sound like snow. My steps became the whisper of silk torn slowly, yet the companion whisper kept pace. No twigs, no brush, only the idea of feet. I tossed a stone to my right. It struck a stump with a wooden cough. The return cough came left, placed as if the forest were solving for symmetry. What bothered me wasn't loudness, but intimacy. The mimicry felt curated, like a museum guard, shadowing me at a distance calibrated to suggest both safety and surveillance. I spoke aloud just to break it, a handful of words about weather and maps, flimsy as paper boats. The trees held them. For 3 long breaths, I almost believed I had embarrassed myself into courage. But courage caved when my own sentence leaked back through the understory, not ahead or above, but from the pocket of air at my shoulder. It repeated my words with the slight delay of a bad phone line, vowels stretched thin, consonants sanded smooth, a careful copy wearing my warmth like a borrowed coat. And just before silence, it added a breath I hadn't taken, as if it had learned me and wanted to try the next line first. I didn't run. The body wanted sprint and the mind wanted shrink. But some third part, curiosity's stubborn cousin, held me still the way frost grips a leaf's edge. My heartbeat tapped at my ribs like a polite guest overstaying. If this was echo, it was a new species. If this was a person, they were writing me in pencil first. I said my name softly and heard. It returned, softer still, syllables rounded like river stones. But what I didn't expect was the extra word the voice appended, gentle as mist. Here. I tested the air with questions a scientist might ask while standing on thin ice. How far are you? Are you behind a tree? What do you want? The copycat cadence. Repeated each question, then amended them with prepositions I hadn't chosen, as if grammar were a trail marker it enjoyed moving. The undergrowth smelled of wet tin and crushed fern. I remembered corvids mimicking whistles in human speech, but their mimicry rides on laughter. This rode on listening. It felt like talking to a pond that answered with sentences instead of ripples. I set a crude experiment. I clapped once, hard. A second clap arrived with surgical timing, brighter, as if reflecting off glass. I scraped my boot. The answering scrape sounded from my left, slightly ahead, as though whatever tailed me had sidestepped into my future. In Lin's old notes, there's a line about polynacousis, auditory afterimages that persist like print on eyelids. But afterimages don't move branches. A bough 6 paces away nodded twice, precisely, then settled like a metronome put back in its case. But what if the echo was hungry? Memory should have been my ally. Instead, it moved against me like a tide pulling the shore, backward. I tried to recall the morning, the map, how sure I'd felt about north. Each memory arrived slightly edited, A photograph developed under different light. That was the cleverness. The footsteps had become editorial blue pencil, trimming hesitation, smoothing verbs. When I said I will turn, the echo said I turn, and something rustled close enough to salt my tongue with loam. Every instruction became invitation. Every thought returned pre-approved, a story my grandmother used to tell Rose from childhood about spirits that learn your name to spare you from being lost, or to ensure it. She swore some names are doors and some are lures. I thought of that while I bent to tie my lace, a stall to think. The canopy darkened like a closing iris. I promised to leave the ridge and descend before night. The promise came back as completion, leaving now, and below a rock clacked like flint-struck fire. Who expects relief to sound like permission? Stepped forward and the twins stepped too, a half beat ahead, guiding downslope like leading a dance. My fear didn't vanish. It reorganized, a flock wheeling from panic into pattern. The forest thinned, the light lifted, nickel then pewter. In a pocket meadow, the trail split like a wishbone. My voice whispered, left. The answer corrected me, right. And moments later, a weathered signpost appeared, arrowed right, half swallowed by moss. Gratitude rushed me, warm. When the path narrowed again, the voice spoke my real name in my cadence. The glow was faint enough to question whether my eyes had simply invented it. A bead of light swinging lazily in the distance, suspended among the pines like a star that had gotten tangled in the branches. My boots crunched, softly on the trail, and though I told myself to keep moving forward, my head betrayed me, tilting, tracking the rhythm of that light. It swayed side to side, hypnotic, a pendulum marking time against the breath of the forest. At first, I thought, it was another hiker, a lantern or flashlight bobbing in practiced arcs, maybe someone making camp a little deeper in. The thought brought relief, because the woods at dusk have a way of shrinking a person to childlike scale. Any sign of another human presence feels like a lighthouse on a stormy coast. But then I noticed the pattern. The glow didn't falter on rocks or dip behind trunks. It glided cleanly, uninterrupted, as though the trees themselves bent out of its way. My rational mind scrambled for anchors. Fireflies can emit steady light when disturbed, and swamp gas, phosphorescence born from decay, has tricked wanderers for centuries. But this wasn't a random flicker, it was deliberate. The beam felt almost rehearsed, moving with a cadence that seemed to match my heartbeat. I remembered reading about the false light phenomenon at sea, when sailors swore distant beacons lured ships toward reefs. The forest wasn't the ocean, but in that moment, the pines felt like black waves rising around me. Curiosity pulled, harder than caution. The trail beneath my boots was firm, yet every cell in my body urged me to step off, to shorten the distance between myself and the glow. The more I resisted, the brighter it seemed to become, as if hunger sharpened its edges. My grandmother once warned me that not every light leads home. Sometimes it leads deeper into night. Her words surfaced like driftwood, but still I followed. The terrain changed almost immediately. My soul sank into softer soil, spongy with needles and hidden roots. Each step whispered with damp surrender. The lantern, if I could still call it that, remained the same distance ahead, neither closer nor farther, always coaxing but never allowing touch. I began to wonder if I was chasing, or if I was being led. The silence pressed heavier the deeper I went. No insect thrum, no owl's query, just the constant rhythm of my own breath and that light moving like a charm. I thought of anglerfish, their bioluminescent lures hanging in the abyss, hypnotizing prey into swimming willingly into jaws. Science offered comfort, but also dread. If evolution could sculpt deception into survival, what did it mean that this glow moved with such precision? I stopped to test it. The light halted too, mid-sway, frozen like a pendulum caught in a photograph. The realization cut through me like ice. I took a step backward, and though it lagged by a breath, it mirrored me, pulling one sway behind. My chest tightened. Was it responding to me, or correcting me? And then, without warning, the glow dimmed, not faded, but extinguished. leaving the forest in a crushing blackout so complete it felt like I had stepped into the absence of existence itself. The blackness dropped like a lid, sealing the bowl of the forest until even my breath sounded borrowed. I held my hands raised, as if balance could be negotiated with air, and waited for my vision to climb back from its plunge. It didn't recover. It thinned, like ink poured into a well. I tested the ground with a toe and felt only soft litter and the give of rot. If a light dies, you can blame the bulb. When a light teaches you to want it, darkness feels like your mistake. I counted to anchor myself. 10, 20, 50. Each number, a knot on a rope I could climb. I rehearsed the Purkinje shift, reminding my brain that color abandons us first, and shape remains. Resin breathed from a wounded trunk. A twig ticked somewhere like a metronome losing faith. Sound wasn't thrown, it was poured. The silence wasn't absence but medium, thick as oil, and I felt it join the sweat at my neck like a second skin. But what if the medium had teeth? Night pressed close, patient as a teacher, awaiting honesty. A dime-sized gleam kindled near my boot, not red but green, foxfire brightening in a seam of rotten wood. Another bead woke, then another, islets of cold flame stippling the duff. I'd read about bioluminescent fungi, luciferin and luciferase bartering photons in the dark. Science fluttered like a moth inside my skull, yet the points organized into twin dotted lines and curved downhill, a tiny runway stitched with ghosts. No lantern now, only suggestion arranged like a signature, beckoning as gently as a finger curled from a doorway. I stepped despite myself, forward. I followed because I'm the kind of animal that follows patterns. Each footfall coaxed new beads from crushed threads of mycelium, a breadcrumb trail that glowed brighter behind me than before me. I imagined stored sunlight teased out by pressure, yet the path refused to dissolve into coincidence. It flowed like handwriting, elegant and foreign, practicing my name with a flourish I'd never use. I told myself to stop. My calves negotiated. 2 more steps, obedient as students copying lines they do not understand. Curiosity tugged like a small insistent tide. A prickling climbed my forearms. The air fizzed. When I rubbed 2 quartz pebbles together, a blue gasp flared. Triboluminescence, a squeezed star between stones. My scalp lifted as stray static tugged my hair. I spoke into the dark and heard not echo but shape, a reply wearing my cadence. Without my breath, far downslope a pale coin relit, as if the lantern had chosen a new theater. I stepped once. It retreated once, the way bait keeps perfectly out of reach, patient as a cat at a mouse hole. Practiced and patient. I thought of my father teaching knots after a river nearly took me, his hands over rope. I flagged branches with orange tape, left. An arrow waited ahead, tied with my knot, pointing deeper in. I checked my compass. The needle leaned toward the glow, slid back, leaned again. At a ravine's lip, I stopped. Across the gap, the pale coin brightened, then went out. Behind me, a warmer light blinked twice, human yellow. It hadn't guided me, it had led me away. I stood trembling. Which light wanted me alive? Midnight in the forest is not silence, it is a chorus of tiny frictions. The shuffle of leaves beneath unseen feet, the occasional snap of resin in a cooling trunk, even the murmur of my own pulse pressing at the eardrums. That night, lying in my tent, I had begun to drift into the shallow waters of sleep when a sound knifed through the stillness. It was a baby's cry, thin at first, then sharper, trembling at the edges like glass about to shatter. I froze. The sound seemed impossible, absurd in a wilderness where no families camped for miles. And yet it carried the same pitch I had heard on buses and in waiting rooms, the desperate shrill of life demanding attention. Scientists say our brains are wired to respond to that frequency, the way moths are drawn to flame. The cry slices, through exhaustion, through reason, through everything but instinct. And in me it did exactly that. I felt an ache in my chest, a pull to unzip the tent and find the source. But the woods at midnight are not nurseries. I told myself it was an animal, some predator mimicking the sound, exploiting our biology the way anglerfish wave lures in the abyss. Studies on cougars and foxes have documented mimicry, sounds reshaped to trick prey. My rational mind repeated this like a prayer. It is not a child. It cannot be a child. And yet the cry reached into the ancient circuitry of my brain, a strand, older than reason. I pressed my palms to the sleeping bag, fighting the urge to move. The sound wavered just beyond the nylon wall, so close I imagined condensation frosting on tiny lips. I thought of my sister, rocking her newborn at dusk, the same rhythmic sobs puncturing the quiet house. That memory nearly broke me. Compassion warred with dread in a stalemate that left me trembling. If I opened the flap, would I see a child? Or Jaws? The cry deepened, shifting from infant wail to something uneven, almost playful. It cracked mid-note, then rose again, a parody of distress. I realized with a jolt that I was no longer hearing need, but performance. The cadence grew stranger, as if a throat practiced sounds without understanding them. A giggle threaded through the sob, jagged and wrong, like static masquerading as joy. My scalp prickled. Babies do not laugh through tears like that. Every instinct shouted retreat, but there was nowhere to retreat to. The tent was my skin. Thin nylon stretched between me and whatever had learned the melody of helplessness. My flashlight lay by my hand. I gripped it, thumb trembling on the switch, debating whether light would reveal safety or sharpen teeth. Then came silence. Sudden, absolute, suffocating. The kind of silence that doesn't feel empty but full, packed with presence. I held my breath until spots clouded my vision. Finally, I exhaled. Relief flickered until I heard it again. Not crying this time, not laughter, but the slow drag of claws etching lines into the earth inches from where my head lay. When morning came, I would see what those claws had written. But in that moment, staring into black nylon, I knew the forest had just tested how far my compassion would carry that only light could glue back together. Dew threaded silver across the fly, and when I unzipped it, the world breathed pine and cold iron. On the soil outside the door, claw marks radiated like a thrown crown, arcs, and divots layered over one another, some fresh enough to glisten. The impression stopped exactly where the shadow of my tent had been, as if the night had set its hands on the fabric and listened to my fear through its palms. The ground looked as though it had pressed its ear to me. I traced spacing with a twig, counting between gouges. Too narrow for bear, too regular for coyote, and not quite the needle pricks of raccoon. A careful creature, or a careful performance. My mind pivoted back to the sound, to the way infant cries cluster in that harsh band between 2 and 5 kilohertz, the roughness that rakes awake the mammal brain. That frequency is a key. Some doors open automatically when it turns. What I heard wasn't just a key, it was a practiced hand on the lock, testing for tumblers. Guilt worked through me like cold water finding seams in stone. If somewhere a real child had needed me, I had failed in the most human way. The thought sat in my chest like a stone crib. I pictured my sister at 3 a.m., the patience, the soft pressure of a palm on a tiny spine. I hated the part of me that had stayed zipped inside. Yet another part whispered that survival sometimes requires ignorance, like a lantern shielded with a hand in high wind. Which instinct keeps you decent and which keeps you breathing? I decided to ask the morning a question. I set my phone to record, slid it beneath the cookpot, and stepped back into the tent with the flap cracked. I didn't mimic a baby. My throat rebelled, but I spoke in low reassurance, the cadence you use to braid a sob into steady breath. I let the words ride the air like thin smoke, offering comfort to emptiness. Then I waited, every nerve a listening post, wondering which world would answer, the human or the one that studies us. The reply arrived not as sound, but as weight. Nylon dimpled inward above my boots, a single fingerprint pressed by air. The cookpot jittered on its rim, and the recording captured a string of soft clicks, spaced like a small animal testing glass. Then the voice came, mine wearing a borrowed mouth. It soothed and cooed on cue, but between vowels threaded a wet scrape, the kind of texture teeth add to syllables when they're learning shape before meaning. I saw nothing. The wall exhaled and stilled, like a lung deciding. Wind found the needles. Sun shouldered higher. Birds returned in tentative staves, then with confidence. The world resumed its usual grammar, but the punctuation felt off. I checked the pot. A crescent score bit its rim, neat as a fingernail dragged through paint. On my screen, the waveform looked like sea pickets, peaks even where I hadn't spoken. Some wildcats mimic prey, some birds master alarms and chainsaws. Predators learn the buttons we cannot help but push. But what rehearses us with our own tenderness? I packed with the deliberate care of someone folding a flag after a ceremony. Before I struck the tent, I found 4 faint furrows, inches from the door, parallel and close, the spacing right for fingers pressed lightly to feel breath through cloth. A test or a benediction. At the trailhead hours later, a ranger mentioned a coyote chorus and asked if I'd heard the racket. I said nothing about the laughter braided through crying. That night, the recording whispered one extra word I never spoke. Soft, curious, almost proud. Mama. The trail had been alive with sound. Leaves whispered in high registers, cicadas droned like distant engines, and our own footsteps struck a rhythm against the dirt. But then, as we crested a small ridge and the trees parted, all of it collapsed. We stepped into a clearing that seemed carved from the world's marrow, and the moment my boot touched grass, the air fell mute. It wasn't simply quiet, it was an erasure, as if some unseen hand had lifted the needle from the record of reality. I opened my mouth to speak, but the words never arrived. My lips moved, my throat strained, yet nothing emerged. It felt as though the silence had weight, pressing against my voice, flattening it before it could rise. Around us, the trees leaned slightly inward, their crowns tilting like an audience craning to hear a sound that refused to be born. The clearing became a bowl, and we were insects trapped beneath glass. One of my friends, Daniel, tried to laugh. His shoulders shook, but it was a pantomime, a silent film stripped of soundtrack. The sight unnerved me more than if he had screamed. Instinct told me to measure my breath, but even the rasp of air in my chest had vanished. It was sensory deprivation, in the raw, like the chamber experiments where volunteers lose their grip on self within minutes. In that silence, you don't just miss sound, you begin to doubt your own existence. I clapped my hands together hard, desperate for proof. My palms stung, but nothing followed. The impact collapsed into nothingness, like a stone dropped into a bottomless well. Fear slid in quick, sharp as ice water. What if this was not a place where sound failed to travel, but a place where sound was consumed? The grass at the center shimmered with an unnatural clarity, each blade standing upright as if drawn with ink. Daniel strode toward it, shaking his head in disbelief, eager to prove the spell an illusion. His boots pressed the stalks flat, but we heard nothing, not even the faint crunch of chlorophyll surrendering. He grinned back at us, mouth wide, perhaps to say, "See? Nothing to be afraid of." But then his shadow betrayed him. As he reached the very heart of the clearing, his figure elongated across the ground in sharp relief, dark against the sunlit blades. I watched as the shadow seemed to detach, stretching longer than his body allowed, as though the light itself wanted to remember him differently. Daniel turned once, expression puzzled, and then he was gone. No collapse, no blur, no movement. Simply absent, the clearing swallowing him as effortlessly as it had swallowed sound. Only his shadow remained, etched deep into the grass, a stain of darkness lying flat without its owner. We stood at the edge, frozen, our throats raw from screams that never made it into the air. I felt the pull then, that terrible curiosity, to step closer and test whether the clearing could write me out just as easily. What if silence here wasn't absence at all, but appetite? We did not dare cross the line where the grass turned glassy. We formed a semicircle and spoke with our hands. Mouths were useless, language pinned like a butterfly. The shadow held Daniel's posture like graphite holds a sketch. No breeze touched it. Sunlight inked its edges darker. Grief flared and guttered. If sound had a predator, it had eaten more than noise. Theo fished a river stone from his pocket and raised his brows. I nodded. He lobbed it across the bowl. The arc looked ordinary, until the stone touched the midpoint and ceased to be anything. There was no thud, no bounce, not even a shift of light. Just an oval absence kissing the grass beside Daniel's silhouette. Mathematics misbehaved in front of us, subtraction applied to matter. Mara's eyes shone, furious and wet. I remembered. The university chamber where volunteers faltered because even their pulse deserted them. This wasn't lack but appetite, like a Helmholtz mouth swallowing pressure before it became a vent. Maybe the clearing only spared what moved by touch. We rigged a rope around my waist and another to a trunk behind me. Mara checked the figure 8 with the tenderness she saved for breakable things. Her hands shook once, then stilled, a metronome, deciding mercy. 2 steps in and the world thinned. My heartbeat, breath, the whisper of fabric, deleted. My boots bent the stalks, yet my body felt floaty, as if the ground were an idea considering whether to hold me. I stared at Daniel's outline and understood why people test ice that already groans. Hope is a bridge you step on as it fails beneath you. I lifted my foot toward the center. The rope lay slack behind me, a pale vein on green. Mara yanked me back. On the sheath, a faint scorch scored the fibers, heat written without sound. She pressed chalk into my palm. Dust, her lips shaped. I clapped. A white cloud drifted toward the middle. The powder obeyed until it reached the dark patch, then folded down, vanishing like confetti in water. But what none of us expected was the ripple. For a heartbeat, the etched silhouette shivered, as if light remembered movement. The hand section rose a finger's width, separate from the arm, then stilled. Where his wrist would be, a darker oval, pulsed like a moth under glass. Hope detonated in my chest, bright and painful. I stepped forward and the clearing answered by deepening its hush, a pressure change like weather turning inside out. The rope trembled once, then went slack, as if distance had lost meaning. We piled a cairn on the rim and retreated to the trees, where birdsong returned in shy syllables. Outside the bowl, our voices came back hoarse and stunned. We swore we'd return with bodies and gear, stakes and sensors, names to force order onto whatever this was. But at dusk, another wrongness appeared. As the angle of light shifted, 3 shadows stretched from us toward the clearing and would not retract. Thin tethers drawn arrow straight to the center, humming like wires in wind. They tugged softly, steady as a patient tide. Night pooled, waiting like a closed throat. Which part of us had the silence already claimed, and how much more would it take to finish the trail felt obedient, a simple thread through the forest's loom. We had marked our way with bright ribbons. Orange strips knotted around trunks, each one a promise that we could always retrace our steps. Every few yards, I glanced back and felt the quiet relief of color against bark. Those flags were our breadcrumbs, and I trusted them like one trusts a map. But by morning, the woods had betrayed us. The first marker was gone. The knot I had tied so carefully, with a double hitch my father had taught me, had vanished without fray or trace. At first I assumed I had miscounted. Maybe it was 2 trees back. But as we searched, one by one, we realized all of them were missing. Every bright strip of nylon had dissolved into the forest, as though the trees had grown new bark overnight, sealing the wounds we had left. Disorientation crept in slowly, like mist filling a valley. I knew the sun had risen behind us. Yet somehow, its light leaned from the side. The compass needle jittered, as if the forest were a magnet breathing in uneven pulses. I remembered reading about magnetic anomalies in certain landscapes, places where iron deposits warp direction and confuse even birds. The rational explanation steadied me briefly, but only briefly, because no mineral deposit explains trails that bend into loops you swear you didn't walk. By afternoon, every path we chose returned us to the same stump. It was an ugly old thing, half-rotted and carved with insect galleries, like a map drawn by a mad hand. Each time we circled back, we noticed new details, a fresh line of sap, a split widening in the bark. It was as if the stump was learning us. The air thickened with the copper tang of sweat and the bitterness of panic swallowed too late. Theo tried optimism. He laughed too loudly and said the forest was testing us. But his knuckles whitened around his canteen, and when Mara snapped that we were moving in circles, the laugh died in his throat. Hunger made us brittle. Our rations shrank, our patience frayed. I could feel the forest studying us, waiting for the crack. I began to wonder if the woods rearranged themselves when we blinked. Trails that had seemed straight now braided into impossible spirals, as if the ground itself were tilting behind us. The theory terrified me and yet soothed me. If the forest was alive, at least there was intention behind the chaos. If not, then we were merely lost, and there is no cruelty in being lost, only indifference. The sun bled orange through the canopy as shadows sharpened, and just when despair hardened into certainty, Mara shouted. She had found a marker. There it was, nailed high into a trunk, the very strip I had tied 2 days before. But it wasn't as we'd left it. The ribbon hung upside down, the knot tightened backward, as though unseen hands had not only stolen it but returned it altered, mocking the very idea of a way home. And in that inversion we felt the forest smile. We stared at the upside-down ribbon. Theo reached for it. Pretend the world makes sense, and sometimes it follows. He pried the nail free, flipped the strip, and tied my father's double hitch beneath the head. We exhaled like people steadying a table on a crooked floor, then walked. Our steps small corrections in a sentence the forest kept rewriting. We built a cairn of 3 flat stones and scored an arrow into the duff with my knife. When we looped back, the cairn remained, but the top stone had rotated 180 degrees, and my arrow pointed at my own boot prints. It felt like being edited by an unsmiling copy editor. But what sentence were we mispronouncing? I offered science, like bread to a shrinking table. Humans without landmarks drift in arcs. Path integration leaks. Glucose drops muddy judgment. Magnetite might yaw the inner compass. Iron seams can make needles wobble like fish. These thoughts soothed me the way a song soothes a child. Still, minerals do not turn stones, and fatigue does not nail ribbon into bark. Hunger sharpened us to points. Theo's optimism frayed. Mara's patience rang like glass. I kept recalling my father teaching triangulation on a salt flat. Pick 2 things that won't move. Draw yourself between them. In here, our chosen anchors slid an inch whenever we blinked, like magnets skittering under paper. We were being redrawn and the eraser squeaked. We tried a pace count, trading numbers like runners forming a chain. I sketched a crude map with charcoal on birch. A brook, a ridge, the mouth of the road we wanted. Sweat blurred continents into storms. Lines smeared until our world resembled weather rather than land. When the charcoal dried, the map described one feature only, a circular path returning to a stump shaped like a rotten crown. As a last clean test, we lit a twig bundle and watched the smoke write its grammar. It streamed north for 10 breaths. We marched east, 90 degrees honest, and arrived once again at the rotten crown. If the compass lied and the wind lied, perhaps the room itself was turning, like a stage revolving while the scenery smiles. But what moved the machinery? Evening thinned the light to tea. We rationed a square of chocolate each and let it melt like forgiveness. Then I saw them. 3 of our orange ribbons ahead, nailed in a shallow curve, all upside down, knots mirrored as if tied by a left-handed version of me. The arrangement formed an arrow toward a darker seam of trees. It looked like help wearing, a smirk. We followed because you follow arrows. The seam opened into a narrow corridor where bark showed fresh shinings, as though hands had smoothed columns before ceremony. My stomach cramped, my mouth tasted metallic, like biting a coin. The corridor debouched into a clearing we did not know we knew, and the stump waited, patient as a judge. I refused the circle. I hammered our last strip high and true, not facing the way out, and clenched the empty roll like a talisman. We turned to leave. A soft ticking sounded behind us. We pivoted and saw our final ribbon hanging from another trunk 10 paces off, upside down, nailhead gleaming. My fist gripped nothing at all. It started as a speck on the horizon, an interruption against the clean line of the ridge. At first, I thought it was a tree stump, a boulder, some leftover shape from a landslide years ago. But then it shifted. Not much, not enough to claim movement outright, but just enough that my heart betrayed me. I raised my binoculars and steadied my breath. What I saw was not quite human. Its outline was wrong, shoulders too narrow, arms hanging as if unhinged. It stood tall and still, balanced like a needle stuck into the earth. We lingered in its gaze, for too long, though we couldn't say why. Instinct whispers when you are being watched, the same way you feel heat before flame. My skin tightened as though eyes had weight. Predators use that sensation to their advantage, freezing prey before the chase. Every page I'd read about the psychology of being observed clicked through my mind. Heart rate spikes, tunnel vision narrows, time dilates. Our bodies become the experiment, wired to detect threat in the faintest glance. Theo muttered that it was just a hunter. Hunters don't stand motionless in silhouette for hours. Mara asked if it could be a ranger. Rangers carry radios, reflect badges, step with purpose. This one seemed built from pause. Through the glass, I watched it tilt its head a fraction, the way an owl calibrates. A whisper of dread curled down my spine. The light shifted as evening, folded itself into longer shadows, but the figure did not dim. Instead, it seemed sharper, its edges outlined as though the last sunbeam wanted to make sure we didn't mistake it. I kept glancing away, pretending I wasn't unsettled, and each time I looked back, the figure seemed closer. Not walking, not striding, simply inhabiting less distance, like perspective had been tricked. No sound accompanied the approach, no crunch of gravel, no cascade of dislodged stones, only stillness, broken by the shallow rustle of our breath. The ridge became a stage, and it, the sole actor, refused dialogue. I imagined it rehearsing us, not the other way around, memorizing how our faces faltered in the weight of its gaze. I lowered the binoculars, desperate for my eyes to restore ordinary proportions. But without the lenses, the figure looked taller. And its stance, it wasn't resting on heels like people do. It leaned slightly forward, balance pitched as though gravity meant something different where it stood. That posture was wrong, undeniably wrong. I wanted to ask the forest what rule it had bent to carve that shape. Dusk surrendered to night, and the figure became a deeper piece of shadow on a stage already painted black. But I knew it was still there. You can always feel a watch that refuses to blink. My throat dried. I wondered not what it was, but what the forest wanted me to feel by letting me know it was there. And just before the last of the light died, I saw it tilt again, a gesture almost playful. When I blinked,
I kept the
the distance pressed to my face until the rubber cups bruised skin. Saccades steal frames when we blink. The brain stitches a film and calls it truth. If the figure moved only in those blackouts, it could step between edits like a thief. The idea felt absurd and exact at once. I lowered the glass, counted breaths, and refused to grant the darkness another splice. Predators exploit the feeling of being seen. We freeze because motion makes us legible. My pulse skittered, a moth in a jar. The amygdala doesn't negotiate. Looming shapes get priority. Through the glass, the posture stayed wrong, weight pitched forward as if the earth were steeper under its feet. But what I didn't expect was the tiny sway that matched mine, a pendulum echoing my fear, like a metronome learning my song. We tried light. Headlamps carved white cones, and the ridge answered with a dull metallic sheen. The figure had no eyeshine, no reflective grain, only a silhouette saturated past the night around it. When I crossed the beam over its torso, the edge drank brightness, like cloth dipped in ink. That should have calmed me. It looked like absence, not muscle. But absence can be carnivorous too. I took a photo to demote it to pixels. The first image showed the figure thin as a hatch mark. I tapped again. 3 seconds later it widened. proportions swelling as if the lens had walked for me. I checked the metadata. No zoom slip, no jitter. I'd shot wide and my hands were steady. Perspective had shifted without consent, a magician's force applied to distance. Mara box-breathed, square as a window. Her panic softened to alertness. Her fingers found mine and squeezed once, the signal we promised after the river almost took me last year. Theo's humor cracked and fell away, leaving something steadier, resolve stripped of polish. We drew a line of stones between us and the ridge, a child's spell against a thing that understood adult fear. I tried words anyway, an offering to the dark. My greeting rolled downhill, thin as foil, and came back flattened, as if spoken against metal. The figure adopted my angle, shoulders inclined, head canted, mirroring. Wolves teach through mimicry. Primates model to reassure. But if it reflected us to harvest reactions, which feeling was it hungry for? We backed away without turning, keeping faces forward the way you do with big cats. New rule, only one of us blinks at a time. Eyes burned. Tears made small constellations of glare. Whenever Theo's lids crashed shut, the silhouette crept a finger width closer, then stilled under my stare. Vigilance became a relay we could not drop. By full dark it had left the skyline and stood, among the first boulders, still without sound, a cutout stapled to the nearer world. Below it, the ground showed no prints, only two faint parallel dents dragging upslope like sled runners, shallow and straight. Ozone flavored the air, as if lightning had been folded and pocketed. I took one more photo and felt my stomach drop. In the frame, our shadow line lay only behind Mara and Theo. Mine was missing, peeled from my boots and standing where the watcher had been a breath earlier, poised at the boulders, facing us, perfectly. The first crackle arrived just after sunset, when the trees had swallowed the last rim of light and we'd gathered close to the fire. Our handheld radios, meant only for chatter between campsites, hissed alive with static. At first it was ordinary interference, the kind you blame on atmosphere or cheap circuits. But then the noise shaped itself into something sharper, familiar. A voice, my own voice, repeating a sentence I had spoken minutes earlier. We should ration the last of the water. The air seemed to collapse inward. Mara and Theo froze, eyes darting to mine, as if I'd orchestrated a trick. But the radio lay on the ground between us, untouched, emitting our conversations in delayed fragments. The cadence was exact. Every hesitation, every inflection, replayed, like a ghost rehearsing lines it had overheard. Theo tried to explain it away. Radio skip, he said. Signals bounce off the ionosphere. Sometimes you hear yourself looped back with seconds of lag. His voice wavered even as he gave the lecture. We all knew the odds of such perfect mimicry were slim. I picked up the unit, thumb brushing the worn plastic, and spoke a test phrase. We're not alone out here. The silence that followed stretched so long I thought the test had failed. Then the static surged, and my words came back in a hollow whisper, distorted but intact. We're not alone out here. A second later, Mara's laugh, her real laugh, sharp and nervous, bled through the speaker, even though she hadn't made a sound. She pressed her hands over her mouth, horrified to hear herself already recorded, already consumed. The fire popped, sparks spiraling upward like lost signals. I thought of electronic voice phenomena. The EVP recordings paranormal researchers claim reveal whispers from beyond. Most are crackles and half-phrases shaped by hope. But this was different. This was exact, clinical in its precision, as though the forest itself had become a tape recorder with a mind of its own. We set the radio on a log and circled it like archaeologists unearthing an artifact. The speaker hummed low, the kind of undertone you feel in your teeth more than your ears. Then, slowly, the pitch rose, and a new voice, my own again, spilled out. But this time it wasn't echoing the past. It was predicting. Don't argue with Mara. She's right about the compass. The words pinned us. We hadn't argued, not yet. But seconds later, Theo snapped at her for tapping the compass against her knee, claiming she might demagnetize it. The fight bloomed exactly. As the radio had foretold, down to her tone of defiance. By the time silence fell again, we were staring at each other with expressions I'd only ever seen in mirrors. Disbelief reshaped into fear. I wanted to smash the device, but I also wanted answers. Was the forest bending time around us, feeding the radio fragments of a future already written? Or had we simply stepped into some feedback loop where our choices were no longer ours? As the fire guttered low, the unit sparked one last time, delivering a message none of us had spoken yet. A rasp, drawn out and deliberate. Don't pack up, it's waiting. The message rang in the marrow, and I set the radio down as if it were hot enough to brand. The forest thickened around the fire, trunks rising like pillars in a drowned cathedral. We tried to pretend the sentence was a prank of physics, that it carried no intention. But intention had a taste. It was metallic at the back of the tongue. I told myself not to pack, then felt the strange relief of obedience, like slipping into a jacket that already knew my shoulders. We chose to test it. I wound the dial through weak channels and held the antenna high. Static yawned, granular. A patch of sky opened where stars gathered like salt, and in the speaker a murmur braided into words. 2 minutes, it said in my voice, thinner, stretched like a tape left in the sun. Don't look behind the fire. The instruction arrived the way thunder arrives after heat lightning, late but heavy. Theo snorted and looked anyway. Nothing stood. There, only the black seam where the trees began. But the fire hissed as if rained on, and a wave of cold unrolled from the seam, smoothing ash like a hand across bed sheets. Mara moved closer to me, and I felt her need travel through bone. Under. The surface of the speaker, a second channel quivered. A moth behind glass. Water now, it urged. We drank, and the water tasted charged like it had borrowed a storm. I asked a question without words, the way you ask the sea for mercy when waves rise past your chest. The reply climbed out of the hiss with surgical clarity. Stay in the light. Do not count to 60. It shouldn't have mattered. And yet the prohibition nagged at the mind the way a scab begs a nail. Theo started counting in his head anyway. I knew because his lips found shapes before numbers. On 30, the radio exhaled my laugh. On 45, it repeated my old confession about the river. On 59, it borrowed my father and said my name the way he did when he wanted me to listen. We broke. I snapped the battery free, and the speaker died like a trapped bee slipping into silence. The night, deprived of its toy, inflated around us, insect song returning in threads, wind combing the canopy with a slow rake. For a moment I felt normalcy flood back, cheap and grateful. But what they didn't expect was how the silence bent in under its own weight and returned the words anyway. No hardware required. The message bled from the dark, faint, then crisp. Left path, not right. We argued. Probability, maps, the angle of a slope we barely remembered. Shame and hope fought. Inside me like cousins in a small room. In the end, we obeyed, stepping where the voice suggested. The trail narrowed into a throat of alder, and beyond it a meadow breathed pale. My compass settled like a coin at rest. Relief fluttered, a shy animal at the edge of camp. Then the radio, dead in my pocket, warmed against my leg like a living thing, and a new sentence rose as if from my ribs, perfectly in my cadence, already tired of my fear. When you see the lantern, don't wait. Trail dissolving into guesswork when the trees finally thinned. A clearing opened before us, and in its center sat a cabin. Neat, upright, utterly ordinary. It shouldn't have been there. Our maps were blank. In this quadrant, and we had been circling for what felt like days without a single sign of human construction. Yet there it was, a square of amber light spilling from its windows like a beacon. At first, relief surged through us. The sight of straight lines and right angles in the wilderness can feel like a miracle, the human hand carved against the chaos of nature. The cabin looked welcoming, firelight flickering from behind drawn curtains, a thin curl of smoke lifting into the dusk. My chest loosened as if safety itself had taken form, but safety in the woods is a dangerous promise. It shines brightest just before the trap closes. Mara urged caution. She scanned the tree line, muttering that cabins meant owners and owners meant questions. Yet Theo was already halfway across the clearing, his boots sinking into grass heavy with dew. I followed, unwilling to split. The closer we came, the stranger it appeared. The wood siding was new, not weathered by storms or rot. The porch boards bore no mud, no scuffs, no sign of long use. It felt staged, as though a set had been built overnight just to catch our eyes. The door was unlocked. Inside, warmth pressed against our skin, thick and even, as though the hearth had been burning for days. Furniture stood in orderly rows, a table laid with bread, a pitcher of water, bowls stacked neatly as though waiting for us. None of it bore dust, none of it aged. The bread was soft when I pressed a finger into it, yet there was no scent of yeast, no crumble of crust. I checked. The labels on tins lined along a shelf. They were blank, metallic shells without dates, without brands. A clock ticked above the fireplace, but the hands moved in reverse, steady as a heartbeat rewinding. Each click landed heavier than the last, the sound burrowing into my skull. Déjà vu gripped me hard. I knew this place, though I had never been here. My grandmother's kitchen, my childhood cabin trip, every safe room I had once loved, folded into this single stage. Neuroscience calls it false memory, the brain cross-referencing, scraps of familiarity into a lie. But what if the lie was intentional? Theo tore off a piece of bread, chewing despite our protests. His eyes glazed, shoulders slumping, as though exhaustion had finally found its bed. Mara dragged him away, but even she couldn't deny the warmth. In the room, the draw of a chair by the fire. I felt it too. The hunger to surrender, to let this cabin hold us until morning. Yet every detail screamed performance. Food that never aged, furniture that never wore, time itself moving backward. We left in silence, forcing Theo outside, the cabin's glow staining our backs. I told myself it was over, that we had resisted the lure. But an hour later, as we trudged through miles of dark pines, the clearing opened again, and there it was, the same cabin, glowing, waiting, as though it had walked ahead of us. At first, I thought exhaustion had looped the night, but the ground disagreed. The ridgeline behind us still bit the sky with the same missing tooth. The brook still mumbled left of the trail, and yet the cabin waited ahead, poured from the same mold of light. My compass behaved like a coin deciding a bet. Theo's shoulders folded with relief that looked like surrender. I felt the tug too, the way warmth calls to skin, but a second call ran colder. The arithmetic of impossibility. We circled wide, trying to catch it at an angle the first miracle had not rehearsed. Our old footprints were absent, as if the clearing were wiped between scenes. Mara whispered that déjà vu is just the brain lagging a fraction, the hippocampus offering a duplicate card from the deck. But what if the card sharp is outside the skull? The glow had a pulse-tied rhythm, brightening when we doubted and softening when we believed, like it could read the air off our skin. I tossed a pebble at the porch. It landed without sound, rolled to the threshold, and stopped. The door sighed inward, though no hand touched it. Warmth breathed out, carrying cinnamon and pine, a sweetness that felt manufactured, like memory from a can. We crossed the sill because humans always step onto stages built for us. Inside, the bread sat whole again, the pitcher full, the bowls stacked in even tens. Above the hearth, the clock marched backward, a tidy river pulling hours home. I touched the mantle and came away clean, no film, no ash. A row of frames faced the room. Their photographs were gray fog until I looked straight on, where my face surfaced, then sank when my eyes slid away. Trick of angle or obedience test. Theo reached for the loaf and froze. A bite was already missing, his bite. The crooked tooth stamped in soft crumb. The room had saved his hunger like a pressed flower. The scientist in me tried to name it: source monitoring error, false familiarity, stagecraft. Yet every label slid off like rain off oiled paper. We carved our initials under the table and walked out, hauling Theo by the sleeve. The clearing cooled as if a thermostat had been rolled back. We followed the brook for a mile, then 2, counting, switchbacks. When the trees thinned again, the cabin stood ahead, patient as a buoy returning in every tide. This time we refused the threshold. We circled the exterior, palms on planks, measuring seams, listening for a hollow belly that would betray a traveling show. The boards answered with the certainty of bone. I pressed my ear to the wall. The ticking synchronized to my pulse, then overtook it, like a conductor seizing the baton. But none of us expected the second clock, faint above the rafters, ticking. Forward, 2 metronomes fencing with time. We ran. The light chased us in ellipses, appearing ahead like a host reopening doors. We sagged on a ridge. Night dropped. In the valley, 3 squares winked where no roads ran. Cabins, or the same cabin copied. The urge to surrender rose like tide in the throat. Safety, sugared. I held Mara's hand until the tremor passed and asked, "If a house remembers you first, what are you walking into now? Subscribe, if you dare."